it was called to mind that the Platonic ideas of the different grades of beings, which are the adequate objectification of the will to live, exhibit themselves in the knowledge of the individual, which is bound to the form of time, as the species, i.e., as the successive individuals of one kind connected by the bond of generation, and that therefore the species is the idea broken up in time. Accordingly, the true nature of every living thing lies primarily in its species, yet the species again has its existence only in the individuals. Now, although the will only attains to self-consciousness in the individual, thus knows itself immediately only as the individual, yet the deep-seated consciousness that it is really the species in which his true nature objectifies itself appears in the fact that for the individual the concerns of the species as such, thus the relations of the sexes, the production and nourishment of the offspring, are of incomparably greater importance and consequence than everything else. Hence, then, arises in the case of the animals, heat or rut, and, in the case of man, the careful and capricious selection of the other individual for the satisfaction of the sexual impulse, which can rise to the height of passionate love, to the fuller investigation of which I shall devote a special chapter hence also, finally the excessive love of parents for their offspring. In the supplements to the second book, the will was compared to the root and the intellect to the crown of the tree, and this is the case inwardly or psychologically. But outwardly or physiologically the genitals are the root and the head the crown. The nourishing part is certainly not the genitals, but the villi of the intestines, yet not the latter, but the former are the root, because through them the individual is connected with the species in which it is rooted. For physically the individual is a production of the species, metaphysically a more or less perfect picture of the idea, which, in the form of time, exhibits itself as species. In agreement with the relation expressed here, the greatest vitality, and also the decrepitude of the brain and the genital organs, is simultaneous and stands in connection. The sexual impulse is to be regarded as the inner life of the tree upon which the life of the individual grows, like a leaf that is nourished by the tree, and assists in nourishing the tree. This is why that impulse is so strong, and springs from the depths of our nature. To castrate an individual means to cut him off from the tree of the species upon which he grows, and thus severed, leave him to wither, hence the degradation of his mental and physical powers. That the service of the species, i.e., fecundation, is followed in the case of every animal individual by momentary exhaustion and debility of all the powers, and in the case of most insects indeed by speedy death. That in the case of man the extinction of the generative power shows that the individual approaches death, that excessive use of this power at every age shortens life, while, on the other hand, temperance in this respect increases all the powers, and especially the muscular powers, on which account it was part of the training of the Greek athletes. That the same restraint lengthens the life of the insect even to the following spring. All this points to the fact that the life of the individual is at bottom only borrowed from the species, and that all vital forces, as it were, force of the species, restricted by being clammed up. But this is to be explained from the fact that the metaphysical substratum of life reveals itself directly in the species, and only by means of this in the individual. Accordingly the lingam with the yoni, as the symbol of the species and its immortality, is worshipped in India, and, as the counterpoise of death, is ascribed as an attribute to the very divinity who presides over death, Siva. But without myth or symbol, the vehemence of the sexual impulse, the keen intentness and profound seriousness with which every animal, including man, pursues its concerns, shows that it is through the function which serves it, that the animal belongs to that in which really and principally its true being lies, the species, while all other functions and organs directly serve only the individual, whose existence is at bottom merely secondary. In the vehemence of that impulse, which is the concentration of the whole animal nature, the consciousness further expresses itself, that the individual does not endure, and therefore all must be staked on the maintenance of the species, in which its true existence lies. To illustrate what has been said, let us now imagine an animal in heat, and in the act of generation. We see a seriousness and intentness never known in it at any other time. Now what goes on in it? Does it know that it must die, and that through its present occupation a new individual, which yet entirely resembles itself, will arise in order to take its place? Of all this it knows nothing, for it does not think. But it is as intently careful for the continuance of the species in time, as if it knew all that. For it is conscious that it desires to live and exist, and it expresses the highest degree of this volition in the act of generation. This is all that then takes place in its consciousness. This is also quite sufficient for the permanence of the kind, just because the will is the radical and knowledge the adventitious. On this account the will does not require to be guided by knowledge throughout, but whenever in its primitive originality it has resolved, this volition will objectify itself of its own accord in the world of the idea. If now in this way it is that definite animal form which we have thought of that wills life and existence, it does not will life and existence in general, but in this particular form. Therefore it is the sight of its form in the female of its species that stimulates the will of the animal to the act of generation. This volition of the animal, when regarded from without and under the form of time, presents itself as such an animal form maintained through an infinite time by the constantly repeated replacement of one individual by another, thus by the alternation of death and reproduction, which so regarded, appear only as the pulse beats of that form which endures through all time. They may be compared to the forces of attraction and repulsion in which matter consists. That which is shown here in the animal holds good also of man. For although in him the act of generation is accompanied by complete knowledge of its final cause, yet it is not guided by this knowledge, but proceeds directly from the will, to live as its concentration. It is accordingly to be reckoned among instinctive actions. For in reproduction the animal is just as little guided by knowledge of the end as in mechanical instincts. In these also the will manifests itself, in the main, without the mediation of knowledge, which here, as there, is only concerned with details. Reproduction is, to a certain extent, the most marvelous of all instincts, and its work the most astonishing.